Picture this. It's September 10th, 1513. You're standing in a slaughterhouse made of mud. The fighting has stopped, but the violence hasn't. Looters swarm the field like carrion birds, ripping armor and clothing off bodies at a brutal pace. 10 noblemen stripped every minute. They flip one corpse after another, hands slick with rain and blood, until suddenly, someone freezes. This body is different. Wrapped tight around the man's waist, biting deep into raw, swollen flesh, is a heavy iron chain. Not something placed there by an enemy, but something he wore willingly. You're staring at the corpse of King James IV of Scotland. This isn't just a fallen soldier. This is the last monarch in the British Isles to be butchered in combat. And that iron belt? It wasn't a battlefield accident. It was a secret penance, his own private punishment, dragged into the catastrophe we now call the Battle of Flodden. In just 3 hours, this man led the largest, most advanced army in Scottish history into a trap that erased an entire generation. So how does a genius king end up naked in English mud, shackled by his own guilt? Before we dive into this forgotten nightmare of survival and suffering, if you enjoy uncovering the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more stories like this. And comment below where you're listening from. Because it still blows my mind that people from all over the world are exploring these ancient tragedies together, connected across centuries by the same curiosity. Now, if you want to understand the butchery, you have to understand the victim. James IV was not a fool, not even close. He was a Renaissance powerhouse. While England struggled to stay stable, James turned Scotland into a weapon. He spoke 8 languages. He funded alchemy labs. He personally performed surgeries to test new medical theories. He didn't just build a navy. He built the Great Michael, a warship so massive it terrified the rest of Europe. Brilliant, wealthy, fearless, and dangerously confident. But he was also haunted. That iron belt tells the real story. Years earlier, James, still a teenager, became the face of a rebellion against his own father, King James III. The rebellion succeeded, but at a horrific cost. His father was killed, and whether James ordered it or not didn't matter. The guilt shattered him, so he forged a heavy iron chain and locked it around his waist as a permanent punishment. Every year, on the anniversary of his father's death, he added another link. He wanted the weight to grow as he aged, like a physical reminder that time wasn't erasing what he'd done, a psychological ticking clock, and it drove him to chase redemption through glory. Then, in 1513, he saw his chance. His brother-in-law, Henry VIII, had invaded France, leaving England exposed. James saw an open goal, and he didn't just declare war. He emptied his kingdom. He summoned the full might of Scotland. This wasn't some ragtag border raid. James marched south with the latest European plate armor, tens of thousands of troops, and a train of heavy siege cannons that made other kings jealous. They felt invincible. They crossed the River Tweed, smashed through English border fortresses, and tore down walls that had stood for centuries. They were the apex predators of the North. But they forgot one thing. War isn't fought on paper, and it isn't fought with guilt. It's fought in the dirt. Because as James marched his magnificent, heavy army deeper into England, the sky turned black, and the rain began to fall. Torrential, relentless. The kind of English rain that doesn't stop. It only decides how miserable it wants to be today. The roads turned to sludge. The ground became a glue trap. The stage was set. The trap was dug. and the tragedy of Flodden was about to begin. While James was locking iron around his waist, a different kind of metal was moving across the chessboard of Europe. To understand why this slaughter happened, we have to talk about one of the most romantic and honestly idiotic objects in Scottish history: a turquoise ring. It arrived in Edinburgh carried by a French messenger, not from a lover, but from the Queen of France, Anne of Brittany. France was being hammered by the English, and in desperation, Queen Anne needed Scotland to open a second front. So she appealed directly to James's vanity. She sent him the ring off her own finger, along with a challenge that sounded like it came straight out of a fairy tale. Step just one pace onto English soil for my sake. It was a trap wrapped in silk. But James, the last true knight of the medieval age, took the bait. He didn't see a political maneuver. He saw a damsel in distress. He put the ring on, and he committed his kingdom to war over a gesture. He thought he was walking into a chivalric tournament where honor would decide the victor. He was wrong. He wasn't fighting a tournament. He was stepping into the orbit of the most dangerous woman in Europe. Because James assumed England was defenseless, while Henry VIII was away. But he forgot who Henry left behind. Sitting on the throne in London as regent was Catherine of Aragon. Forget the tragic divorced woman history later remembers. In 1513, Catherine was 27 years old, heavily pregnant, and absolutely terrifying. She was the daughter of Isabella of Castile, the warrior queen who drove the Moors out of Spain. War was in Catherine's DNA. While James wrote flowery letters of challenge, Catherine signed death warrants. She didn't panic when word of the massive Scottish invasion hit London. She didn't flee. She went to work. She famously declared that while her husband was busy capturing French towns, she was busy defending his kingdom. She ordered coastal defenses fortified, supply lines organized, and then she issued one cold, pragmatic command. The North must defend itself, and she didn't send some young, hot-headed noble to meet James. She knew exactly what kind of war this was going to be. She needed a butcher, not a jouster. So she reactivated a man who was supposed to be retired, Thomas Howard, the Earl of Surrey. Surrey was 70 years old, ancient for the time, a relic of the Wars of the Roses, a man who had clawed his way back from disgrace and who wanted one last victory to secure his family's future. Catherine knew Surrey wouldn't fight for honor. He'd fight for survival, and she handed him the armory with one simple directive: stop the Scots. The contrast couldn't have been sharper. In the north, James IV treated war like a pageant, bringing bishops, poets, even his personal choir to the battlefield. In the south, Catherine treated war like a business transaction. She sewed banners with her own hands while drafting logistics that made Henry's French campaign look like a skirmish. James thought he was marching against a distracted England. Instead, he was marching against the tactical heritage of the Spanish Reconquista, commanded by a pregnant queen with no patience for chivalry. The turquoise ring had started the game, but Catherine of Aragon was about to flip the board. If you had stood on the Burgh Muir outside Edinburgh in August of 1513, you wouldn't have seen an army. You would have seen a nation on the move. James didn't just call for soldiers. He summoned something that felt like a crusade. What gathered there was the largest, best-equipped fighting force Scotland had ever produced, and quite frankly, ever would again. We're talking over 30,000 men, maybe closer to 40,000. But numbers are boring. Let's talk about quality. In centuries past, Scottish armies were often mocked as disorganized mobs of spear-wielding peasants. Not this time. James emptied the royal treasury to modernize everything. He imported thousands of suits of Milanese and German plate armor. He drilled his men in the latest continental tactics, and he gave them 18-foot-long pikes, massive weapons modeled after the terrifying Swiss phalanxes that dominated European battlefields. This wasn't medieval chaos. This was a professional war machine, designed to crush. But the crown jewels of this army weren't even the men. They were the monsters being dragged behind them. James was an artillery nerd. He loved gunpowder. He loved the science of it, the spectacle of it, the power of it, and he brought a siege train that made other kings drool. The stars of the show were the Seven Sisters, 7 identical, colossal bronze cannons cast by master gunner Robert Borthwick. These weren't crude iron tubes like older artillery. These were polished works of art, capable of smashing stone castles into gravel from a mile away. Imagine the noise when this host began to move. 400 oxen were needed just to drag the guns. The ground shook under the wheels. Armor flashed in the summer sun. And when they crossed the River Tweed into England, they didn't just invade, they bulldozed. The mighty English border fortresses, Norham, Etal, Ford, castles that had endured sieges for centuries, crumbled in days. The Seven Sisters barked, and the English walls fell. It was too easy. And that was the problem. Because James and his commanders looked at those smoking ruins and felt invincible. They had the numbers. They had the technology. They had momentum. They set up camp and waited, treating the invasion like a royal hunt. They feasted on English livestock, slept in captured English beds, laughed like the war was already won, and they waited for England to come begging. But while the Scots celebrated, the weather began to turn. The summer sun vanished. Roads churned up by thousands of boots became rivers of muck. The massive wheels of the Seven Sisters began to sink and drag. That heavy German plate armor, so magnificent on the parade ground, started to feel like a prison. And those 18-foot pikes, built for flat European plains, became awkward poles of misery in the slippery hills of Northumberland. James had built an army perfect for sieges, perfect for dry European summers. He had built a Ferrari, and now he was about to drive it straight into a swamp. He didn't know it yet, but his greatest assets, his heavy guns and heavy armor, were slowly becoming his death warrant. Because while the great Scottish army sat pretty, a hungry pack of wolves was closing in from the south. If James's army was a shining Ferrari, the English army was a battered pickup truck that refused to die. Leading them was Thomas Howard, the Earl of Surrey. And I cannot stress enough how unlikely a commander he was. 70 years old, in an era where men were considered elderly at 40. Surrey should have been beside a fire with a blanket over his knees. Instead, he was in the saddle, riding through relentless storms, his arthritic joints screaming with every mile. He was an old wolf, scarred, cynical, and fighting for his life. Because Surrey knew the truth. If he failed, the Tudors would likely execute him. If he won, he could secure his family's future and restore their honor. He had nothing to lose, and his army, they were a mess. Surrey didn't have time to summon the polished professional forces of the South. He had to scrape together a pickup team from the northern counties. Yorkshiremen, Lancastrians, borderers, 26,000 men thrown together out of necessity. They didn't wear shiny Milan plate armor. They wore padded jacks, thick coats of canvas and wool, often soaked in vinegar to harden them. They didn't carry 18-foot pikes. They carried the weapon of the English peasant, the billhook. We'll talk much more about the billhook later. But for now, understand this. It wasn't originally a soldier's weapon. It was a farmer's tool, meant for pruning branches, modified to prune limbs. Ugly, short, brutal. And what this army lacked in glamour, it made up for in grit. While the Scots feasted on beef and wine, Surrey's men marched on empty stomachs. They drank from puddles, slept in ditches, and still, they kept moving. Surrey drove them relentlessly across boggy terrain at speeds that shouldn't have been possible. And there was another problem. The rain. The legendary English longbow, the weapon that had dominated battles like Agincourt and Crécy, was almost useless in this weather. Bowstrings go slack when wet. Glue dissolves. Arrows warp. Surrey realized early on that this wouldn't be a battle of arrows. It would be a knife fight in a phone booth. So as they approached the Scottish position, the English soldiers looked like drowned rats, exhausted, hungry, soaked to the bone. But they had one thing the Scots didn't: desperation. They were fighting for their own land, their own homes, and on September 5th, the old wolf arrived. He saw James's army perched high on a fortified hill, bristling with cannons. A younger commander might have ordered a suicidal charge up that hill. Surrey did something else. He stared at the impregnable Scottish position, spat into the mud, and decided to cheat. Because he wasn't going to play James's game. He was about to rewrite the rules. This is the moment the battle was actually won and lost. Not with a sword, but with a map. James was camped on Flodden Edge. Imagine a natural fortress, a steep hill with sharp drops, surrounded by marshland. Perfect. If Surrey's tired men charged uphill, they'd be slaughtered before they even reached the top. James knew it. Surrey knew it. It was a stalemate. James sat up there, comfortable and dry, waiting for England to make a mistake. Surrey even sent taunting letters, challenging him to come down and fight on equal ground like a man. James replied, essentially, "I'm a king. I stand where I please." So Surrey flipped the table. On the morning of September 9th, Surrey ordered his army to break camp and march away. To the watching Scots, it looked like retreat. They must have cheered. But Surrey wasn't retreating. He was performing one of the most audacious flanking maneuvers in medieval warfare. He marched his men in a wide loop, crossing the River Till at Twizel Bridge, circling all the way around the Scottish position. And here lies the tragedy of James IV in one brutal image. While Surrey's army bottlenecked across that narrow stone bridge, single file, vulnerable, exposed, the Scottish artillery commanders begged James for permission to fire. One volley from the Seven Sisters would have shattered that bridge. It would have turned the English army into a pile of bodies and broken wood. A perfect kill. James said no. Why? Some historians say fog of war. He couldn't see clearly. But the darker truth fits the man with the iron belt. James refused to attack an enemy while they crossed a river, because it wasn't chivalric. It wasn't fair. He wanted a battle of heroes, not a massacre of logistics. He got his wish, and it cost him his kingdom. By afternoon, the reality hit the Scots. Surrey hadn't retreated. He had appeared behind them. The English were now between the Scottish army and Scotland. The road home was cut. James was no longer the invader. He was the trapped rat. Panic rippled through the Scottish ranks. They had to abandon their fortified camp and pivot their massive, clumsy formation, 180 degrees. They had to move from Flodden Edge down to a lower hill, Branxton Hill, facing the new threat. And as they scrambled into position, the rain began to clear. The chess match was over. The pieces were set. And at 4 p.m., the first match was lit. At 4 p.m., the silence broke, and the Battle of Flodden didn't begin with a sword swing. It began with the loudest man-made sound ever heard in the British Isles up to that point. Master Gunner Robert Borthwick stood beside his beloved Seven Sisters on the slopes of Branxton Hill. He lit the fuse. The ground convulsed. Those bronze beasts roared, hurling iron balls the size of human heads straight toward the English lines below. On paper, it should have been the end of the English army. The Scots had the high ground. They had the bigger guns. They had the range. But physics is a cruel mistress, because the Scottish cannons were perched so high up the hill, and because their wooden carriages were designed for smashing castle walls at eye level, the gunners couldn't tilt the barrels down far enough. A fatal geometric mistake. The Scottish cannonballs screamed harmlessly over the heads of the English soldiers and buried themselves in the mud behind them. The Seven Sisters, the pride of Scotland, were firing blanks. Down in the valley, the English master gunner Sir Nicholas Appleyard didn't make the same error. His cannons were smaller, lighter, uglier compared to the Scottish bronze, but they were field artillery, designed for this exact moment. And because he was shooting uphill, the elevation was perfect. Appleyard ordered a rapid-fire bombardment. The English guns erupted. Unlike the Scottish shots that flew high, the English cannonballs tore straight into the packed Scottish ranks. And it wasn't just solid shot. They fired hail shot, bags of metal scraps that exploded outward like giant shotguns. The Scottish soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder in deep formations with nowhere to run. Iron smashed through expensive Milan plate like it was tin foil. Men were decapitated. Limbs shattered. Ranks that had been drilled into discipline began to wobble. But the deadliest weapon on that field wasn't iron. It was smoke. Black powder filled the valley with thick, burning fog. Within minutes, visibility collapsed into a blinding white haze. The Scots on the hill were being shredded by an enemy they could barely see. They were dying without being able to respond. King James watched his master plan dissolve. His artillery was useless. His men were dying for nothing, and he realized there was only one option left. He couldn't sit there and be shelled into submission. He had to close the distance. He had to escape the smoke. James drew his sword, and instead of ordering retreat, he ordered the opposite, a full-scale charge. He signaled his pikemen to drop their boots, literally taking off their shoes, so they could grip the muddy ground better as they lowered their 18-foot spears. The distance game was lost. Now James was betting everything on the shock of impact. The great army of Scotland began to roll down Branxton Hill, descending into the smoke, leaving the safety of the high ground and stepping into the killing fields below. The thunder was over. The slaughter was about to begin. At first, the charge looked unstoppable. Imagine 10,000 men in shining armor moving like a single organism. Their 18-foot pikes formed a rolling forest of steel tips, the famous Swiss push, the most advanced infantry tactic of the day. Against cavalry, it was invincible. Against infantry, it was a steamroller. As they surged down the slope, the momentum of the Scottish heavy infantry drove the English front line back. For a few terrifying minutes, it looked like James might actually win. English soldiers stared into that wall of spikes and began to buckle. But then Northumberland itself intervened. At the bottom of the hill, hidden like a snare, was a small marshy burn, a shallow stream surrounded by deep, clinging mud. And to work, A pike phalanx needs one thing above all else: cohesion. Every step must be synchronized, every shoulder locked to the next. If the line breaks, the weapon becomes a liability. The moment the Scots hit that stream, their rhythm shattered. Men slipped, stumbled, fell. Heavy plate armor, so protective against arrows, now dragged them downward like anchors. The forest of steel turned into a tangled mess. Pikes jammed into mud, swung wildly, stabbed into the backs of the men ahead. And in that chaos, the Scottish formation lost its density. Gaps opened, and that is exactly what the English had been waiting for. Because the English weren't burdened by heavy armor or long, unwieldy poles. They were lighter, faster, and when they saw the Scottish pike points wobble upward, they didn't run. They ducked, they charged under the pikes, and that's the nightmare of a spear. A man with an 18-foot pike is deadly at 18 feet, but if an enemy gets inside that range, within 2 feet, the spearman becomes helpless. He's holding a giant stick he can't retract, can't swing, can't aim. Desperate, Scottish soldiers did the only thing they could. They dropped their expensive pikes into the mud and reached for sidearms, swords, daggers, axes. They abandoned the modern tactical advantage James had spent a fortune to build and reverted to a close-quarters brawl. But in doing so, they unknowingly stepped into the second trap. They had traded range for crush, and in the tight, muddy press of bodies, the sword was not king. The king was a peasant's tool, and it was about to turn the river red. The duel of billhook versus pike had begun, and the pike had already lost. This is where the battlefield becomes a crime scene. When the Scots dropped their pikes and drew their swords, they thought they were entering noble combat. They were wrong. They'd walked into a meat grinder operated by English peasantry. The weapon that defined Flodden wasn't a sword. It was the billhook. To understand the massacre, you have to respect this ugly tool. A billhook is essentially a curved blade on a 6-foot pole, designed to prune heavy branches, now redesigned to prune men. It had a hook to drag someone down, a blade to chop through bone, and a spike to punch through steel. It was the Swiss Army knife of death. And in the crushing mud of the valley, Scottish knights discovered something horrifying. Their expensive broadswords were useless, because a sword needs room. And there wasn't any. The press of bodies was so tight that men died standing up, crushed by the weight of their own army, unable to lift their arms. The English billmen didn't need room. They worked like laborers harvesting a field. They hooked behind knees, yanked nobles down into the filth, and once a knight hit the ground, buried under 60 pounds of Milan plate, he was a turtle flipped on its shell. He couldn't get up. Then came the finish. The billman found weak points, armpit, groin, visor slit, and drove the spike home. And here's the profound, dark irony we can't ignore. This wasn't just a military defeat. It was a class revolution written in blood. The men dying in the mud were the earls, bishops, lords, men raised in castles, drinking from silver goblets. The men killing them were poor farmers from the English north, unwashed, ragged, starving. They were harvesting Scotland's aristocracy like wheat. Later, when bodies were examined, the wounds told the story. Skulls split clean from crown to jaw. Signature billhook blows powered by the full strength of manual labor. The Red River wasn't poetry. Blood mixed with rain and mud until the ground became a slurry that made escape impossible. The Scots fought like lions, but they were being butchered like cattle. And in the center of this vortex of violence, James IV fought forward. not from a safe hill, not surrounded by comfort, but in the mud, in the crush, stepping over the bodies of his own friends, trying to reach the one man he blamed for it all, the Earl of Surrey. History is full of kings who watched battles from a distance. James was not one of them. Seeing his army disintegrate, he didn't flee. He dismounted, grabbed a weapon, and stepped into the slaughter alongside his men, tactically foolish, heroically absolute. If Scotland was going to die today, he would die with her. What followed was one of the most dramatic last stands in European history. James led a wedge of his finest knights deep into the English line, carving forward with the frenzy of men who knew they were doomed. Accounts say he fought to within a spear's length of Surrey, so close you could have seen the old general's eyes, but he never reached him. Archers and billmen closed in. James was struck by arrows, weakened. Then a billhook swung from the chaos and sliced through his lower jaw. Another blow caught his neck, and the King of Scots fell. He didn't die instantly. He bled out in the dirt, trampled under boots belonging to men who had no idea who they'd killed. Around him, the flower of Scottish chivalry formed a human wall. Earls, bishops, clan chiefs, refusing to surrender, fighting until they too were cut down. They fell in layers, piling on top of each other, a monument of loyalty. When the English cleared bodies the next morning, they found the king at the bottom of the pile, surrounded by the corpses of his closest friends. And the indignity didn't end there, because the looters stripped him naked. And that's when they found it. The iron belt. The secret penance hidden for years, exposed to the cold morning air. Far away in London, Catherine of Aragon received the news not with horror, but grim satisfaction. She wrote to Henry VIII in France, telling him that while he had been busy capturing French towns, she had captured a king. She even wanted to pickle James's body and send it to Henry like a trophy, like a hunting prize. Her advisors urged her not to, so instead, she sent something else. James's blood-stained surcoat, the royal garment torn apart by billhooks, shipped across the sea, and she wrote chillingly, "I send you the piece of the King of Scots' coat for your banners." An ultimate power move. The tragedy of James IV ended not in a royal tomb, but as a grisly souvenir in enemy hands. The king who wanted to be a knight died as butcher's carcass. When the sun rose on September 11th, the scale of catastrophe became clear. England lost perhaps 500 men. Scotland lost over 10,000. But in medieval warfare, not all deaths are equal. The English dead were mostly anonymous foot soldiers. The Scottish dead were the government. Alongside James lay the Archbishop of St. Andrews, 2 abbots, 12 earls, 14 lords, and nearly every major clan chief. There's a saying in Scotland, after Flodden, there was not a single noble family that did not mourn a father, husband, or son. The golden age of Scotland died in that mud. The dream of a Renaissance kingdom was replaced by instability, child kings, and eventually absorption into England. To this day, Flodden isn't remembered with a victory march. It's remembered with a lament. The most famous folk song in Scottish history, "The Flowers of the Forest," was written to mourn this tragedy. The flowers were the young men of the Ettrick Forest, the best and brightest, who marched south and never came home. When you hear that haunting melody on bagpipes, you're hearing the sound of a nation breaking. So what's the lesson 500 years later? Flodden is proof that technology doesn't guarantee victory. James had the best guns, armor, and tactics. He had the Ferrari. but he lost to a pickup truck. Hungry men with rusted tools who understood the ground beneath them, and Flodden is also a warning about hubris. James fought the war he wanted to fight, not the war that existed. In the end, the iron belt he wore to punish himself became a prophecy. He sought redemption in death, and he found it, dragging his kingdom down with him. The field of Flodden is quiet now. The mud has dried. The blood has washed away. But if you stand there on a rainy September afternoon and listen to the wind through the grass, you can almost hear the warning echoing through time. The brightest flowers are often the first to be cut down. If this story of pride, tragedy, and the iron will of the past moved you, please subscribe to the channel. We have so many more lost chapters of history to uncover. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next documentary, where we might explore what happened to that ruthless queen, Catherine of Aragon. And right now, click the video on your screen to dive into another incredible historical mystery. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.